You know, I watched a police video the other day of a lady that was being pulled over by a police officer. And the police officer walked up to the car and said, "I need to see your driver's license and registration." And the person said, "What was I doing wrong?" And the police officer said, "Well, you were speeding and it was a very healthy 15 mile an hour over the speed limit. We'll leave it at that." And the person said, "What did I do wrong?" And the police officer said, "Well, you were speeding." And the lady said, "I was following 3 other cars. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just following them. How can you say I was driving too fast when I was just following other people?" And she went on to say, "You can't pull me over because others are doing the same thing." I'll spare you the details. It didn't end well for the lady. But as I was thinking about the book of Habakkuk, in relation to this lady's comments, you can't pull me over because others are doing the same thing. Or, you can't pull me over because someone was going faster than me because I was following them. How do we address the issue of God correcting people and using wicked people to correct other people? Is that fair? Is that just? As we look at Habakkuk tonight, here's the main lesson from this little Old Testament book with a great big message, and that is this. God is not indifferent to sin. He's not inconsistent with how he will judge sin. So, do right and have faith in God. God's not inconsistent. God is not indifferent. He will judge sin. Therefore, just do right and have faith in God. Now, it's just a little book of 3 chapters. Now, we've been moving through, Lord willing, we have just about every Wednesday, we've tackled one entire book. Now, to do that, I appreciate those of you who you get the text and you go, okay, I'm going to read up. I'm going to see if I can get ahead. So Habakkuk was a contemporary of Nahum, of Zephaniah, and of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah, because that was a bigger book, a lot of times we'd say, oh yeah, I kind of have an idea of when he was. But that would place Habakkuk during the reign of Josiah. Josiah was a king from 640 to 609 BC. 640 to 609 BC. And he was also during the reign of Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, from 609 until 698. Now think for a moment before I tell you what was happening during these times. 640 down to, and I'm going to give you another number, I'm hoping it's just going to jump off of the page yet, 640 down to 586 BC. 586 BC. Or I could give you a hint, 586 BC. What happened in 586 BC? Well, I don't know. Okay, there are certain hangers for the Old Testament that will really be of help. 2000 BC, Abraham, which also then would give you Job. 1400, 1500, 1400, but we're going to go with 1400 because it's just going to be a place setter. That's Moses. 600 years between Abraham and Moses. The book of Judges is in 1300s. That's kind of a bonus. That's not necessarily a huge hanger, but it is really beneficial. Solomon lived 1,000. So who else do you know lived at about 1,000? David. Excellent. You're right on this. Who else do you know was about 1,000 then? If David was there and Solomon was there, who else was there? Bathsheba. You got me on that one. I didn't see that one coming. Okay. That's true. I was thinking Saul, but we could go with Saul. A man named Rehoboam. What happened in Rehoboam's lifetime? Pardon? Divided the kingdom. That's at about 900. Now, as you're thinking, 722 BC. It's a huge event. That's when the northern kingdom was taken into captivity. They disappeared. 586. Have you heard that number before? 586 is when the southern kingdom went into captivity. So, you've got a 70-year captivity. If you think about the captivity in Babylon, who else do you then know of that would have been living at about that time? Who? I'm sorry. Daniel, thank you. And who did you say? Go back to Bathsheba. No. So you've got Daniel that lived during this time. So you've got Daniel, you've got Jeremiah, you've got Ezekiel. You know, what's interesting to me is how much of the Old Testament is really compressed into this time period. Your Isaiah was in the 700s. Jeremiah's in the 600s. Ezekiel was in the 6 and 5s. And all of a sudden you begin realizing this is a really, really, really important time in Israel's life, that you've got a lot of the Old Testament books are from this time period. So Habakkuk is one that lived right at about the demise, the captivity of the southern kingdom. You know, Habakkuk knew the Old Testament scriptures well. He was a competent theologian. And Habakkuk had great faith in God. And some would say, because if you read chapter 3 of Habakkuk, it reads like a psalm, that Habakkuk was a priest, which very, very possibly could be. That would put him in the same company with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. But what's interesting is you're going to find Habakkuk writes, he's got some questions. How could a holy God use a wicked nation like Babylon to chasten Israel? Or at this point, Judah. You know, by faith, we're going to see at the end of the book, by faith he embraces God's wisdom and he clings to God's promises. But I want you to notice Habakkuk wrestles with the spiritual decline of Israel. It's interesting. Habakkuk says, God, do something about Israel. Israel's a mess. Israel is fallen apart. Theologically, Israel is falling apart morally. God, do something to fix our nation. And then he says, well, God, I didn't mean the Babylonians, because they're worse than we are. And he's going to go through these questions. And I want you to think about, what can we be learning from this little book? And I'm going to share my thoughts with you as we come to the end of it. But first of all, in chapter 2, verse 4, we find this phrase: the just shall live by his faith. Martin Luther, that was the Reformation verse. Martin Luther took it out of Romans. we're going to find that this phrase, the just shall live by faith, or here in Habakkuk we read the just shall live by his faith. We're going to find that in Romans chapter 1. We're going to find it in Galatians chapter 3. We're going to find it in Hebrews chapter 10. And each one encourages a different aspect of the Christian walk. But first of all, let's get into Habakkuk chapter 1. And verse 1 just introduces who the prophet was, the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. And then we dive right into Habakkuk's first question. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee. Literally, he's saying, the first one is, I am asking you a question. The second one, he's literally crying out saying, stop this. Don't let this go on. I cry out to thee out of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention. So we pause and we look at verses 2 and 3, and we recognize Habakkuk knew that the kingdom of Judah was rapidly deteriorating. Civilization that they had, for years, they had been in these glory years. And they had had a king that was doing the right thing. And when the king died and his son took over, he saw things deteriorate very quickly. If you want to know God's thoughts on this, let's just keep your finger here. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 22 for just a moment. We won't pause for long, but I think it merits looking at. Jeremiah chapter 22. And I'm going to begin reading at verse 13. Notice what Jeremiah, who is prophesying to Judah before the Babylonian captivity. Okay, so that put it in that context. Because you got to remember, why did the Babylonian captivity come? Because Israel was sinning and God was saying, enough. Notice verse 13 of Jeremiah 22. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. That saith, I will build me a white house and large chambers, and cutteth him out windows, and it is sealed with cedar, and painted with vermilion. Shalt thou reign because thou closest thyself in with cedar? Dost not thy father eat and drink and do judgment and justice, and then it was well with him? He judged the cause of the poor and needy, then it was well with him. Was not this to know me, saith the Lord? But thine eyes and thine heart are not, but for thy covetousness, and for to shed innocent blood, and for oppression and for violence to do it. We pause there, and all of a sudden you realize, look at the description of society. It was a very selfish, self-centered society. It was full of violence. If you look at those couple verses there in Habakkuk, it was full of violence, full of iniquity, full of grievance, which is the idea of misery. It was full of spoiling, which is destroying things. It was full of strife. It was full of contention, which is disputes and arguings, and injustice. It was a society that wasn't even making sense anymore. Now, let's just pause for a moment. We'll pause our study for a moment and just think of what's happened in Minneapolis. A person comes into a school and shoots. What's going on? What's going on is the fact that because we have so deteriorated our morals and we have said anything you want to do is going to be okay because you're really the most important person in society, rather than being a part of society, you are the society. What happens? Now we find shootings and killings. We find thefts. We find people that are cheating people out of their livelihood. We find people that are stealing, and they think nothing of it. They're speeding, and they say, I didn't do anything wrong. They're speeding too, so you can't pull me over. that's the society in which we live. And Habakkuk cries for help, and Habakkuk screams, God, do something! And what's the problem? Look in verse 4 with me of chapter 1 there. Therefore the law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous. Therefore wrong judgment proceedeth. Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you. So in verse 4, we find society's problems. The rich exploited the poor and escaped punishment because they were bribing the officials. The law was either ignored or twisted, and nobody seemed to care. The courts were crooked. The officials were interested only in money, and the admonition of Exodus 23 was completely unheeded. Listen, Exodus 23, this is how God says it should be. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of the poor in his cause. Keep thee far from false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of righteous. He's saying, don't get into this. You need to do the right thing. You need to do it because it's right, not because you've made extra money out of it. Habakkuk's saying, God, look at all that's going on. Why won't you do something? And we see in verse 5, God's answer. Behold, ye among the heathen, and regard the wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, and more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as an eagle that hasteth to eat. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. God's answer is, I'm going to punish Israel. You're right, Israel needs to be fixed. And I'm going to use a wicked kingdom to do it. And Habakkuk goes, no, God. No, God. You know, God describes the Chaldeans, and they sound unstoppable. He uses animals to describe what they are like. And God is telling him, I'm not indifferent to sin. I will judge sin. Cindy and I were talking about this text earlier, and you think, how long do we expect God to just put up with what we do? We're just used to the routine. We're finding we're losing our freedoms because we put up with unrighteousness in our communities. We put up with injustices. We put up with evil back dealings. And we're seeing our society deteriorate. How long will it be till God says, I'm going to allow something in your nation to draw you back to me? It's God's kindness. That's not God's meanness. That's God's kindness, where he says, come back to me. And we don't listen. So he'll allow something which removes all the things that are keeping us from seeing our own wickedness. I don't know. I would like to see us repent and not go through that. I don't glory in what might take place. In fact, I shudder at that, but it's not my deal anyway. God's the one who's going to handle things. But I want you to notice God says, I am not indifferent to sin. I am going to deal with Judah. Judah will go through difficult times. But it's not going to be what you expected, because I'm going to use a wicked nation. Now we start in verse 12, and God says, I'm not inconsistent. Now that from the text, it's really worded the flip of that. God, are you inconsistent? He says, art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment. And Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he? You see what his argument is? God, how can you allow this to happen? We're more righteous than they are. Isn't that an interesting comparison? Well, yeah, we're doing all these things, but we're not doing that. I was doing 90, but I wasn't doing 95. How can you give me a ticket? How can you pull me over? I'll let that one go. Okay, so we come back to the text, and you realize what he's saying here? He is telling us, I am not indifferent, and I am not inconsistent. But Habakkuk is questioning God's goodness. He's questioning God's decision-making. You're going to judge them, right? Aren't you? You know, do you ever have those kind of questions in your mind? People of faith always have to confront problems. An old pastor from years ago, G. Campbell Morgan, made the statement, if you believe in God, you sometimes wonder why he allows certain things to happen. We live in a really wicked world. How many times? Cindy was commenting today as we were watching the families coming out of the school in Minneapolis. And she said there's going to be some parents that aren't going to be holding children's hands. Because their children didn't make it. And there will be some that will say, God, why? Why didn't you take out that murderer? Why didn't you take out that guy that was coming to shoot? Why did you allow the children to be injured? You know, like Habakkuk, the doubter questions God and may even debate with God. God, why are you doing this? But the doubter doesn't abandon God. Unbelief is rebellion against God, a refusal to accept what God says and does, rather than dialoguing with God and saying, God, tell me why, what's going on. Unbelief is an act of the will, while doubt is born out of a troubled mind and often a broken heart. You know, when I'm sitting with someone at a hospital and they're going through depths of despair, that's usually not the time that I try to debate with them. Oh no, God is good. There will be a time for that. But often there's a time where we're questioning, we're saying, God, I know you're good. I don't understand this. Remember when we studied Jonah? Jonah questioned that. Nineveh was as wicked as wicked could be, except for maybe Babylon. And God used Nineveh, the Assyrians, to chasten the northern kingdom of Israel. And Jonah was going, God, why would we do this? And you remember what God did? It was very interesting. God used Jonah to bring a revival to Assyria. But it didn't last long. And by the point where Habakkuk is writing right now, 6:10, Assyria is gone. God raised them up. God blessed them. They didn't respond, and God humbled them. So you've got Habakkuk saying, God, why are you going to use a wicked nation? And if we were the ones answering, we would say, in reality, God has used war to draw a nation back. When the terror of, are they going to be flying planes over my house and dropping bombs on my house? Not because they're trying to hit my house, maybe they're trying to hit just north of us, but that's awfully close to be dropping bombs as far as I'm concerned. Natural calamities. Hurricanes, when I lived in Charleston, hurricanes were pretty big deal. Tornadoes, pretty big deal here. God sent the prophets to them, and the people didn't listen. You know, something that we don't like to consider, and that is this: the greater the light that has shined on us, the more responsibility we have to respond to that light. So was God righteous for using a civilization that did not even know him to bring chastening to a society that knew him and chose not to obey him? Absolutely. I found it fascinating. It was, in fact, God's blessing that it was causing Israel, they weren't going to pursue false gods anymore. When Israel comes back from the Babylonian captivity, they do all kinds of things that are wrong, but you don't see them get back into idol worship. I mean, even today, you talk to Jews, I mean, they are very careful. They won't even spell G-O-D, and they definitely will not use that name. They will write G-D if they've got to write it. I mean, they're very careful with God's name. Oh, they learned a lesson. They didn't get it completely, but they did learn. God was gracious to them. But you know what's interesting is it was, in fact, one that was in captivity that was used to bring Nebuchadnezzar to an understanding of who God was. You never know how God's going to use you or me. The Babylonians didn't know the true and living God. You know, how often do we want to blame others and see them judged when we've had more light than they've had? That's a sobering thought. I mean, I've had a lot of light in my days. When I get really angry at other people, I need to really just pause and think, they don't know what I know. Why am I angry at them? Why am I not more upset with the decisions I make? Habakkuk ends chapter 1 by saying, how long are you going to let them continue to destroy nations? How long are you going to let Babylon continue to slay the nations? How long? How long is the war over near Russia going to go on? How long? Notice God's message in chapter 2. God says, I want you to write these things down. And I'm glad that he did. He said, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to see what God has to say because of what I just asked God. God, how long are you going to do this? And Habakkuk was one of the prophets. He was a watchman. And the Lord answered him in verse 2 and said, write the vision, make it plain upon the tables, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie, though it tarry, wait for me, because it will surely come and will not tarry. What's he saying? It's not for right now. It's going to be very soon. But until this takes place, warn people so that they can run to God. They can turn from sin to God. He says, I'm going to make all things right. You can trust me. And then we read verses 4 and 5. Behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him. But the just, he shall live by his faith. Yea, also because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man. So what he's going to talk about is, he says, trust me, not circumstances. You can put your faith in me, And you know, though you don't know what I'm going to do, I've told you I'm going to use this wicked nation, but what you don't know is yet what you can still trust, and that is, I'm going to do it right. I won't do it wrong. I'll get it right. And he uses this phrase, the just shall live by his faith. Now he's going to talk about the proud. So you've got proud people. The proud people transgresseth by wine. He's a proud man. He keepeth not at home. He enlargeth his desire as hell, and as in debt, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. So he says, understand this. Alcohol can get people into trouble. Pride can get people into trouble. You know, pride is like death in that it makes you dissatisfied. There's never enough. Death always wants more. Pride makes you restless. I should have more than what I've got. I'm not content with the things that I have. And he compares the proud to the just. The one emphasizes God's grace because grace and faith always go together. We see a little later in chapter 2, he talks about God's glory. And in chapter 2, verse 20, he emphasizes the fact that God's in charge. You see, justification is God's graciousness whereby a believing sinner is made righteous. So now we have to look at it and say, okay, so what is the confidence that Habakkuk was learning as he saw God? Faith is a lifestyle that's the opposite of being puffed up. It's the opposite of depending on your own resources. We live by faith in the person, in the character of God. I don't know how God's going to fix things. I just know he will. And it'll be the right thing. And if I had all the details, I would say, yeah, that's exactly how I would have done it, had I known how to do it. So in chapter 2, verses 6 through 20, we read, verses 6 through 8, God says, I'm going to deal with selfishness. Verses 9 through 11, God says, I'm going to deal with covetousness. In verses 12 through 14, I'm going to deal with exploitation, where you misuse people. In verses 15 through 17, God judges drunkenness and violence. In verses 18 through 20, God judges idolatry. Now Habakkuk realizes God does know, and God will judge. So we come to chapter 3, and we realize he says, we have hope as we live by faith in what God says. In verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3, he says, O Lord, I have heard thy speech, and I was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years make known. In wrath remember mercy. He's saying, God, do your work and be yourself. And then verses 3 through 15, all of these instances of God's greatness. Verses 3 through 5, he talks about God's provision. In verses 6 through 15, he's going to describe God's power. And then he concludes at verse 16. He says, when I heard what God was going to do, I was terrified. But he says, verse 17, although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the field shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me walk upon mine high places. He's saying, I trust God. So what are some thoughts? Quick things that we learned from Habakkuk. First of all, God is not indifferent to sin. We may look around us and we may see God's mercy and we are saying, God, where are you? What are you doing? And God is not inconsistent because God will deal with sin. So the lesson to us is do right and trust God. That's the reason why I don't get a gun and go up and start killing people. God will get it right. If I didn't trust God, then I'm going to take justice into my own hands. But I do trust God. Second lesson, meditate on what God has said. We live by light, and God's word is light. I've been doing a Bible study with someone, and we've been studying out of Ephesians chapter 5, and it was fascinating to me. He said, you were darkness. He didn't say that you were living in darkness. He said, you were darkness. And now he says, he didn't say, now you're living in light. He said, you are light. How does a person become light? Scriptures tell us, in thy light shall we see light. Scriptures tell us that we are to let our light so shine before men. What happens when we allow our light to be seen? They glorify God. We live in a very dark world. But wherever we go, we are light. And that light is what allows the world to see God. We learn from Habakkuk, pray for God to do his work. I don't know how God is going to work things out. I just know it'll be right. So I'm going to pray. I'm going to partner with God to do his work. And I'm going to live by faith. I'm going to live by trusting God. Habakkuk. It was a quick run through, quick flyover, but hopefully it gave you some things to be thinking about and maybe connected it to the time frame so that you understand, oh, here's what's happening in the world at this point. You're in the 600s BC, and Judah is on decline. Israel is already removed because Israel didn't repent.